I'm Amy from Doodle Dog Designs.
For the last 2 years, I have been working on a project with my Zoom Loom. It was a Christmas gift for my children. Each one received a blanket that I made from hand-spun wool from the sheep we had when our kids were growing up. The project started with me making this blanket for our middle daughter because she was the shepherdess in the family.
To design the blanket, I used graph paper and coloring pencils. The Zoom Looms make 4-inch squares. I figured out how big I wanted the blanket, and then I calculated how many squares I would need to make that happen, and I decided I wanted my blanket to be about 40 by 72. 40 inches by 72 inches, and then if you divide 40 by 4 inches, it's 10, so that's going to be 10 squares, and then 72 divided by 4 is 18, so it's going to be 10 by 18 squares. Each one of the squares on my graph paper is going to represent a square on my blanket. So I'm going to do 18 squares. By 10 squares. And each square is 1/4 of an inch on this graph paper, so I know that 4 squares is an inch, so there's 8 squares and there's 10. And then I started coloring these squares to make the design. Now I'm going to make this look easy here, but in reality it took me quite a few tries before I got this to be the way I wanted it to look. And I did do half squares in this. And I just repeated this on the opposite side. On one side I used black yarn for the features on the sheep, and on the other side I applied black and natural colored yarn together to make the speckle look on that sheep. So then I counted up the number of squares, and then once you know how many squares you need of each color, you can multiply that by the amount of yarn it takes to make a square. And then I did add extra in what I was making because I knew I was going to want to crochet around the edges. So after I finished making all of the squares, I used a double overcast stitch to join them. And I have this book, Pin Loom Weaving, and it has different joining instructions in the book, and I used the double overcast stitch. And just a word of caution, if you use that stitch, it does definitely have a front and a back to it, so just make sure you're sewing each seam on the correct side. And I did use a matching color to stitch the squares together, so I used one or the other of the colors of the 2 squares that I was stitching together. And I stitched up rows, so I did 1 row and then I did another row, and then I would sew those 2 rows together, and then I did another row and added that. When I got it all put together, I did do 3 rows of single crochet all the way around. I started with the lightest pink, and then I did the medium pink, and then the darkest pink around the very outside. And when I had it all together before I added the crocheting around the edge, it just didn't look finished. Adding the crocheted edge really made it look finished. For the second one that I made this blanket using different colors. Instead of the yellow, I did a gray, but it was the first time that I had used the Zoom Loom to do more than one color on a single square. So it was a fun way to do things different. So when I put this one together, I did it as it suggested. I put each of the larger squares together with the 9 pieces, and I used a matching color to
sew the smaller squares together into the large block.
When I put all of the big 9 block squares together, I used a teal yarn,
and then I single crocheted around the entire blanket.
And then when I made the third blanket, I liked the look of the 9 squares, so I did something similar to that again, but I drew out on graph paper again how I wanted it to look. I wanted to do it a little bit different.
So I sewed these 9 squares together using thread that matched one of the squares, and then I crocheted each of these squares together using green yarn, and then I crocheted around the edge, first with the green and then with the dark gray. I hope this inspires you to make a blanket of your own with your pin loom.
Be sure to click the like button and subscribe below. I'll see you next time. Bye.